When we first bought our 42 acres up here in the mountains of southeastern Idaho, I knew I was going to need a serious piece of equipment because it was completely untouched ranch land that was very heavily treed, but I also knew I had a budget. The first piece of equipment that I used up here was a mini excavator that I rented in town, and there were some things about that mini excavator that I really liked. The stability aspect of it was probably one of the most important things on a hillside up here. But it was super slow. Moving around was super slow, and it wasn't big enough. But I continued to look for excavators, and I actually found an old excavator from the 80s that I just about bought, but there were two issues that I had with that excavator. The first one was how heavy it was, how hard it was going to be to move around. Just to have it delivered over here at my property was going to cost me probably $700 or $800. And then the other issue was for the price. The price was actually really good, but was I going to be able to get parts for it? I then, somewhere along the way, I purchased an old 1961, it was a Ford 861D, D for diesel. That tractor was a tremendous blessing. The price was perfect on it. The guy listed it on Craigslist as an 8N diesel, which I knew there was no such thing as an 8N diesel. And when I drove over there and saw it, it ended up being a 65 horsepower Ford tractor. And I used that thing every which way but Sunday. I used it to maintain the roads. I used it to plow snow. I used it to grade and to pull stumps out. I mean, you name it, I've used it up here. But again, that was limited. It didn't have a locking differential, and it also didn't have, I really needed four-wheel drive. Because of my background in construction, I continue to look at backhoes time and time again. And a good backhoe, especially a big name backhoe, they're not cheap. They're just not cheap. But the backhoe might be the single most universal piece of equipment that a person could use on the homestead. So far, I've used my backhoe for everything from pulling stumps to grading, to moving large amounts of dirt, to moving gravel. We're using it to move gravel, to lifting. We knew we needed a four-wheel drive, whatever we got, whether it was just a loader tractor. I have the implements for a 3-point tractor, and they do not work with a backhoe. And so I've got my eyes out right now for another small tractor. But the backhoe to me, like I said, from the septic system to the excavating the footings for the house, the backhoe to me is the most universal tool a person could have up here. I've cut roads in with the backhoe. I've done just about everything I could possibly do. We put the thumb on the backhoe portion of the backhoe, which allows me to pick up and move trees around, which is something that was super important. So if I had one piece of equipment and nothing else, it would have to be that backhoe. Although there is still a need for other things. I would love to pick up an excavator. I'd love to have a dozer. Matter of fact, we've had a dozer up here. We've rented equipment. We've had everything from a D7 fairly large dozer all the way down to that little mini excavator. And that I was able to build my pad better with a backhoe than I was with that D7. And that partly might have been just because I wasn't as experienced in the dozer as I was in the backhoe. But part of the reason why I think a backhoe is probably the most important piece of equipment I could have up here is because I could make a living with it. You know, there's a million guys around the country that have a backhoe and nothing else that make a dang good living. You know, if a person were to get a backhoe and a dump truck, a guy could make a good wage, that's for sure. The average hourly rate for a dump truck and a backhoe around our community is probably somewhere around $100 an hour, and that's a good living. I went with a New Holland backhoe because I felt like they'd come a long way with their construction line of equipment. In the farming aspect, New Holland's been a name for 70 years probably. And in the last number of years, they've taken an interest in the construction equipment, and they're progressively getting better and better and better. My backhoe is 110 horsepower, four-wheel drive, extend-a-hoe, It has a reaching distance of about 18 feet. It's very efficient. I drove it about 6 miles out to the gravel pit, used it all day, and drove it back and used about a half of a tank. And so it's a great piece of equipment. So again, if I had one piece of equipment, nothing else, it would definitely be a backhoe. There's a lot of used and abused backhoes out there. I quickly figured out that if it had more than 5,000 hours on it, I didn't want it. Again, four-wheel drive, I can plow with this backhoe. I can plow the snow with this backhoe. Because it's four-wheel drive, I could get a set of chains for it, which is something we'll probably do down the road. And it's not as stable. I will say a backhoe, if you don't know what you're doing, you could tip that thing on its lid really easily. They're not as stable as an excavator. That's part of the reason why I'd love to have an excavator for the hills to pull stumps out and things like that. But bang for buck, the best bang for a buck absolutely has to be a backhoe. That's for sure.